So U.S. banks start closing Venezuelan bank accounts. And so that starts complicating the situation even further, making the economic process of importing food, for example, more and more difficult. And then, of course, all of this gets elevated much more dramatically than when Trump takes office, just a mere 5 or 6 months after Trump took office in 2017, in summer of 2017, he imposes some much stronger sanctions on Venezuela, very comprehensive ones that basically prohibit any kind of financial transactions with Venezuela. Then those are further exacerbated again in January of 2019. So that now we're in a situation where Venezuela has a practically total economic blockade against it. That is, it cannot export or import anything practically. I mean, it can still it cannot do it through normal legal channels. It has to do it all kind of surreptitiously through partners who are also, so to speak, blacklisted by the United States. It cannot do it through any official regular banks, so it makes all financial transactions almost impossible. And of course, that reduces the volume of imports tremendously. And this has also a much bigger effect than people realize on all kinds of aspects of Venezuelan life. For example, the oil industry that John Oliver was mentioning in terms of it being mismanaged. Well, one of the reasons it's struggling to the extent that it is because in order to run an oil industry, you need relatively sophisticated equipment that Venezuela itself does not manufacture. It needs to import that equipment, whether it's oil drills, whether it's tubes even that are used for refineries, that are used for processing plants. All kinds of parts are missing, and then of course all of it is controlled by actually pretty high-tech computer systems. So all of that, has a tendency to break down and cannot be replaced. And so this has an immediate impact on the volume of oil that Venezuela can export. I think when Chavez died, Venezuela was still exporting something like 2.5 million barrels per day. Now, after all of these waves of sanctions by the United States, it's down to little less than 1 million barrels per day. So it's been reduced to almost 1/3 of what it used to be in terms of oil exports. And it can only export the oil practically to places like Cuba, Iran, China, Russia. Well, Russia doesn't really need it. So
the BRICS nations.
Yeah, well, BRICS includes Brazil, which is not part of that. But yeah, most of it now goes to basically China, India, Iran, actually, as an exchange in order for Venezuela to import gasoline because its refineries have to a large extent stopped functioning. Venezuela had some of the largest refinery systems in the world, which are now almost completely shut down. So the other effect is that it doesn't have enough gasoline for its own domestic consumption. So that's why you see huge lines at gas stations. The worst part, and this is actually, the New York Times did actually have a couple good articles about this, how the secondary effect this has on the economy as a whole. If you don't have gasoline, one of the worst impacts is that means you don't have gasoline for the tractors, which means that you cannot harvest the fields properly. So all of a sudden, this makes
it's an agriculture problem.
An agriculture and the food situation even worse. So it has ripple effects throughout the whole economy, and that's one of the reasons why Venezuela is in an absolutely miserable condition today, relative to when before the sanctions started being imposed. And there's some estimates, actually one of them being done by Jeffrey Sachs, who's a well-known economist at Columbia University, and Mark Weisbrot, who's the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. They calculated that that in the 2 years since in the first 2 years of the sanctions, that are from 2017 to 2019, the sanctions contributed to an increased mortality of 40,000 people dying. that wouldn't have otherwise died, mainly because of lack of medicine, lack of food, those kinds of things, because based on just on the fact that the extent to which the mortality rate increased during the time that the worst part of the sanctions were being imposed. And I think that's probably an underestimate even. And it's, of course, and the other factor, of course, is that lots of people have left the country precisely to try to avoid the dire economic situation.
And there's a big. To hear the rest of this show and more, you can go to This Is Revolution Podcast. Find us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and wherever else you get your podcasts. This is Revolution.